Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Samantha Pettigrew, a member of the ICCT Communications team. Thank you for attending today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording to all participants sometime next week. Everyone currently has their microphones on mute. If you have questions, you can write them in the question block in the control panel at the right of your screen. After the presentation, we will have time to answer questions from the audience. Today, we are going to be talking about real-world usage of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, presented by Peter Mock and Patrick Plotz. Peter will begin with a short introduction, and then Patrick will begin the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Samantha. So we are going to talk about plug-in hybrid vehicles today. We are going to present an analysis of the fuel consumption, of the electric range, and of the CO2 emissions of those plug-in hybrid vehicle models. And before we start, I would like to say a few words about the motivation for that study. We decided that it would be good to conduct such a study because there has been a lot of discussion about plug-in hybrid vehicles, at least here in Europe, especially here in Germany, I think, about how they are being used in reality and what their real CO2 contribution is. There has been a lot of discussion, but there has been relatively little data. And we wanted to contribute with a solid database so that politicians or stakeholders in general can take a stake and better discuss the measures to be taken in order to incentivize plug-in hybrid vehicles for reducing CO2 emissions. If you remember, we from ICCT, we've looked at combustion engine vehicles for many years, looked at the real-world gap between official and the real-world and the official type approval values. And for plug-in hybrid vehicles, we felt there was still a gap that we want to close with this study. So now we're going to present you the results of an analysis of more than 100,000 plug-in hybrid vehicles from Europe, from China, and from North America. And I'm going to hand over to Patrick Plotz from Fraunhofer Institute, who conducted the study as a lead author and who will present you, first of all, the methodology and the key findings before later on I will talk about recommendations that we draw.
Hello, everybody. Welcome also from my side. My name is Patrick Plotz. I'm head of the business unit Energy Economy at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research, ISI, in Karlsruhe, Germany. So thank you for the kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to present the data, methodology, and key findings of this joint study with the ICCT colleagues. And before we begin, let me briefly take the opportunity to acknowledge a lot of support from people around the world. We had lots of discussions with researchers and scientists from the Netherlands, from Sweden, from North America, and they all contributed to the success of this study. But of course, all errors and conclusions and findings are our own. So let me briefly remember all of us about plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Just as a brief definition, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are plug-in electric vehicles that also have a combustion engine and can drive on electricity as well as conventional fuel. So conventional vehicles, of course, have a fuel tank and combustion engine, but cannot be recharged from the grid. Likewise, mild hybrid vehicles, like the standard Toyota Prius, have a small battery, but can also not be recharged from the grid. Which is in contrast to plug-in hybrids, which have both a combustion engine and a battery and electric motor, and can both drive on electricity and conventional fuel. Technically, two types of plug-in hybrids are typically distinguished, which are plug-in hybrid vehicles and range-extended electric vehicles. But for the sake of this presentation, we will not make this distinction very strongly. We'll just call both types of vehicles plug-in hybrids, or PHEVs for short. What's the current status about plug-in hybrids in the world? Well, globally, there are now more than 2 million plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in stock worldwide, which is about 1/3 of the global electric vehicle stock at the end of 2019. The market shares in terms of sales are currently rising, particularly in Europe, where we have 3.5% in Europe in the first half of 2020 and 1.1% in China. Also, from a policy perspective, plug-in hybrids are very important for many car manufacturers because they help them to meet the CO2 reduction targets in Europe and elsewhere and help them to avoid penalty payments. For our study, we started with the assumption that plug-in hybrids actually can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in transport and also help to reduce local air pollution, but their actual potential of this very much depends on their real-world usage. And just as Peter said, we have the feeling that there has been no systematic investigation of real-world PHEV usage so far, and also a systematic comparison to test cycle values has been missing. So the aim of the present study, which has been published just today, is to gain a better understanding of the real-world usage, including electric driving, CO2 emissions, but also annual mileage and so on, of plug-in hybrids in China, Europe, and North America. For Europe, we put a special emphasis on Germany, which is the largest PHEV market in Europe. And we also identified potential policy recommendations, which Peter will present later on. So you can already download the full study right now, and we also have prepared a few policy briefs and summaries in English and German. Now, the database for the study consists of primary and secondary sources. For the primary sources, we collected new data, mainly from online fuel consumption tools. There's a German website which uses that and a similar Chinese website. So all the data I'm going to present later on for China and Germany are completely new. Part of the North American data is also new. The other big source or group of sources for our study are already published reports, scientific studies, existing analysis. And so we take all of these together, and in some parts of the study also compare the actual usage of plug-in hybrids to simulation from conventional vehicles. But one might say that our study is kind of a meta-analysis of new primary sources and existing data taken together. So again, I'd like to thank all of those who contributed a lot to this study. So we had Erik Fiegenbaum, Christian Weber from TOE in Norway, who helped us with understand their data. We had colleagues in China supporting us. We had Scott Hartman and Jill Tull from UC Davis contributing, and a lot of support from TNO in the Netherlands, as well as discussions with many stakeholders from policy and the automotive industry. So which information is available in this sample? We have fuel consumption data, annual vehicle kilometers traveled, and the electric driving share, the so-called utility factor, or for short, UF. As you can see in the table, we distinguish between privately used vehicles, only privately used, and company cars, which play a big role in Europe. And we cover several countries. So of course, the company car sample for Germany is very small, but if you look at the countries itself, we have at least 1,000 vehicles in the sample for each country. In total, we cover 66 PHEV models and 202 PHEV model variants, where a model variant is a specific variant, for example, different power of one and the same PHEV model. So in total, we believe we have a very broad sample, which is sufficient for all countries and user groups to provide some robust findings. So let us switch to the key findings. First and most importantly, the total fuel consumption and tailpipe CO2 emissions. The diagrams show the distribution of actual fuel consumption in relation to the NEDC, New European Driving Cycle fuel consumption, which was the major test cycle in Europe and China until recently. And under the axis of each small diagram, you see the mean values for each particular PHEV model or model variant that we have collected in the sample. And we distinguish between private vehicles in this green and company cars in red. And what we see, like at 100%, that's the vertical dashed line, which corresponds to the actual fuel consumption, and real world is identical to the test cycle NEDC fuel consumption. And what we observe is a broad distribution of fuel consumption values across all countries, and high deviation from the test cycle fuel consumption in all of the countries. So taking all the countries together, typically the real world fuel consumption is 2 to 3 times higher than type approval values for private cars, and even 3 to 4 times higher for company cars. The distribution is very broad, much broader than we've seen these distributions from conventional vehicles. This is now all for vehicles that have been certified according to the new European driving cycle. Part of the sample, but not shown here in this diagram, stems from the new currently used test cycle in Europe, the WLTP, the World Light Duty Vehicle Testing Procedure. And the sample is smaller there, but the pattern is exactly the same. We see a large span of deviations between real world and test cycle fuel consumption, with very high deviation, at least 2 times higher than expected from test cycle values. Now, where do these huge deviations come from? And one of the main factors for this huge deviations is the electric driving share, the so-called utility factor, that is the portion of kilometers driven on electricity. And again, you see small diagrams for the individual countries with their sample sizes, and the y-axis shows the actual utility factor as a function of the NEDC test cycle range. The gray symbols are always the full sample, and the small colored and the colored symbols are for the individual country, for example, Norway in this case. And dashed line again is the test cycle values. So what we observe from the individual countries is that almost all values for PHEV models and model variants, the actual utility factor is smaller than the test cycle utility factor. But we also see differences between the countries. However, across all countries, the mean utility factor according to test cycle is 69%, but the real world mean utility factor is only 37%, so it's only about half of the test cycle value. For company cars, the deviation is again even stronger. 63% utility factor would be expected from the test cycle, but in real world, it's only about 20%. However, you also see noteworthy differences between the countries. So particularly Norway and the US and Canada are quite close to the test cycle values. They don't get above the test cycle value except for a few cases, but they are closer to the test cycle values than for the other countries. Again, the situation is particularly bad for company cars, as you can see in the Netherlands. One of the main questions, of course, is why do we see this little electric driving share? And one of the main reasons, of course, is the charging behavior. So we looked at driving of conventional vehicles and simulated them as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and looked at the simulated utility factor you would expect from the simulation of conventional vehicle driving, and compared that to the averages we see in Germany. And that's the 2 diagrams. So if the plug-in hybrids were charged every night, you would expect more or less the solid line utility factor. And if they were charged only on 3 out of 4 nights, you would expect the dashed line. So we see that for Germany, the average observed utility factors are kind of close to the case of 3 out of 4 nights, but for company cars, it's even lower. So from this comparison, we conclude that charging does not take place once every day, as one might expect, but is considerably less. Looking at the other countries, the very low utility factors in China also indicate low charging frequency, whereas PHEVs in Norway and the United States seem to be charged more often. Apart from the electric driving, of course, an interesting question about the usage behavior is the annual mileage of these vehicles. And the table on the right shows the typical shows the mean annual distance traveled for the plug-in hybrids in the sample. This data is available for Germany and the US. We see for private vehicles, total annual mileage is about 21,000 kilometers on average, and considerably higher, namely 30,000 kilometers for company cars in Germany, whereas for the US, it's roughly 22,000 kilometers. So compared to usage of vehicles in the total fleet, including conventional vehicles, we see that plug-in hybrids as private vehicles drive much more than conventional vehicles. In Germany, for the US, the annual mileage of PHEVs is somewhat similar to the national car average. Now, why is this higher annual mileage important? Higher annual mileage also means more frequent long-distance driving. And we made an analysis for driving of conventional vehicles in Germany and found that long-distance driving with more than 100 kilometers of distance driven in one day took place about 5 to 10% for privately owned vehicles, but makes up 1/5 to 1/4 of the total annual mileage. And the numbers are considerably higher for company cars. So that means these not so frequent long distance driving days, they make up only a small share of days per year, but they have considerable impact on the total annual mileage. That means for plug-in hybrids, even if you do a full recharge every night, this long distance driving clearly impacts your overall utility factor. Now, when we combine the total annual mileage with the utility factors, we obtain the average annual electric kilometers. And we observe that current PHEVs mostly have a range of around 30 to 50 kilometers, and they will electrify between 5 and 10,000 kilometers. And the mean annual electric kilometers is clearly increasing with the all-electric range. However, long-range PHEV, mainly range-extended vehicles, they achieve even more. They achieve between 12 and 20,000 kilometers mean annual driving distance, which is already the same order of magnitude of the fleet average driving in these countries. So in total, that means that even utility factors are often lower than expected, combined with above average annual mileage. This can still mean considerably high annual electric distance traveled. Taking together the electric driving share and the total kilometers driven, and only looking at tailpipe emissions, we're not doing an LCA analysis here. That means that the electric drive, due to this electric driving, plug-in hybrids show between 15 and 55% less tailpipe CO2 emissions compared to conventional vehicles. Well, this calculation assumes that PHEVs at empty battery have similar fuel consumption to conventional cars, but these values are still much lower in terms of CO2 savings than one would expect from type approval values. Now, apart from the usage behavior, the vehicle properties themselves clearly impact the fuel consumption and real-world CO2 emissions. So the diagram shows the fuel consumption in liter per 100 kilometers as a function of test cycle range in kilometers, and also highlighted is the total system power of the individual PHEV models and model variants in kilowatts. Low-powered vehicles are in blue, and heavily powered vehicles are in red. And you clearly observe from the diagram that typical fuel consumption goes down with increased range. But if you look at a fixed range, vehicles with higher system power, bigger engines, higher power, have higher total fuel consumption and also higher CO2 emissions. And we analyzed this quantitatively, and we find that real-world fuel consumption and CO2 emissions decrease by 8 to 14% with each 10 kilometers of all-electric range increase. But real-world fuel consumption and CO2 emissions also increase with 2 to 4% with each 10 kilowatts of system power. Likewise, the mean share of electric driving, the so-called utility factor, increases by 3 to 5 percentage points with every 10 kilometers of driving, and decreases with 1 to 3 percentage points with each 10 kilowatts of system power increase. So clearly, the vehicle properties impact real-world fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. Which brings me to the conclusions. So again, the background of the study was to analyze real-world usage of plug-in hybrids, and they actually can offer significant environmental benefits, but only if they are mainly driven on electricity. And we believe that the present study is the first large international and systemic study of real-world usage. Of course, we used, to some extent, we used existing data from our other colleagues and organizations, but some of the data is also new. But I think huge contribution here is also this kind of meta-analysis, putting all the data together and analyzing it in a coherent and systematic fashion. So what we find is that PHEV fuel consumption and tailpipe CO2 emissions are 2 to 4 times higher than type approval values. Main reason for that is that the share of electric driving is only about half the share one would expect from type approval. And again, the low electric driving to a large extent stems from the fact that PHEVs are not charged every day. Another part of these low electric driving shares are the high annual mileage and long and frequent long distance trips performed by PHEV. Yet, despite the low utility factors, PHEV can electrify and do electrify many kilometers per year. And we also see in the actual data of the real-world fuel consumption that decreasing the engine power and increasing the electric range would improve real-world fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. So with this, I'd like to conclude my short presentation. Would like to thank you again for listening. And the study is now available online, and Peter will present and discuss our policy recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you for summarizing nicely the methodology, the data sources, and the results. So I will try to share my screen now, and I will try to summarize our recommendations that we draw from the analysis. Before I do so, I want to emphasize that for us, it was very important to discuss our results with stakeholders beforehand. So we had several conversations with ministries, with automotive industry, and we wanted to get a feeling for what are the ideas for how plug-in hybrid vehicles can be driven more electric in the future, and what ideas might be realistic to implement and which ones maybe aren't. So with that, let's start at the European level. And as a reminder, let's take a look at the current CO2 regulation in Europe. There we have, I would say, 3 phases. We had the first phase from 2009 to 2015, the very first CO2 standard for new cars, 130 grams per kilometer, which was met in advance. So between 2009 to 2015, at least in the test procedure, we could witness a significant CO2 reduction. Then there is a second phase, which started in 2015-16 and continues until 2021. That's for the famous 95 gram target. And as you can see, the CO2 emissions didn't decrease at all really in that time period. They increased until end of 2019. And only in 2020, it starts, the CO2 emissions start going downwards. We are currently, according to our data, at around 110 grams per kilometer in NEDC, or if you count in all the credits, at around 100 grams per kilometer in the NEDC. And then there's the third phase, which is the 2025 target and the 2030 target, which is actually expressed in percentage reduction, but here converted into an approximate NEDC value. More specifically for the plug-in hybrid vehicles, if we look at the system, it is like that. So until 2022, each vehicle below 50 grams per kilometer of CO2 qualifies for a super credit. So for those kind of vehicles, the manufacturers can count them several times. That applies for all the battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, but also for many plug-in hybrid vehicles. From 2025 onwards, the methodology is a bit more complicated. We will see what the European Commission calls zero and low emission vehicles, ZLEV vehicles. And those CLEV vehicles also qualify for a credit, but depending on the CO2 emission value. So it's not that if you're below 50 grams, you automatically get the credit, the full credit, but you only get a partial credit, and the lower the CO2 emissions are, the more credits you basically get. However, what's the same in both of those systems is that the value of 50 grams per kilometer plays a very important role. And 50 grams per kilometer in a test cycle, as Patrick explained, means about twice to 4 times as much CO2 emission values in the real world, meaning that if the threshold is 50 grams per kilometer, in reality it can be up to 200 grams per kilometer. And even in that new system for the CLEV vehicles, that 50 grams per kilometer threshold applies, and it actually gets incentivized or leveraged by this 0.7 factor that you see in the formula here above. What this factor does is that it basically says that if you have a vehicle with 50 grams per kilometer of CO2, it still counts as 0.3 CLEV vehicles. So even if you just meet the threshold of 50 grams per kilometer, you get the CLEV credit. And then, of course, if you have lower CO2 emission values, you get more credit. So the problem or the challenge that we see with this is that plug-in hybrid vehicles with a relatively low electric range that may not be driven very much in electric mode still benefit from this regulation, from this current regulation. And so from this, we conclude for our recommendations at the European Union level that ideally the threshold for super credits should be lowered. This is the super credits in the first or the second phase until 2021. And from our perspective, the threshold should ideally be lowered from the current 50 grams per kilometer to be more in line with the real world CO2 emission values that we are seeing. Then a bit more midterm is, in our opinion, the recommendation to also change the threshold for the CLEV credits, which currently is 50 grams per kilometer. Also there, we think it should be lowered to be more in line with the real world values that we're seeing. And we think the multiplier, the 0.7 factor that I just mentioned, should be removed altogether because it leverages the effect for those vehicles with low electric range. Maybe a bit more long-term, in our opinion, should be that the super credits or CLEV credits should ideally be demonstrated, or the qualification for those credits should be demonstrated using real-world usage data. For example, using the onboard fuel consumption meter data that will be collected from this year onwards. Those consumption meters are mandatory in new vehicles, and the official authorities will collect plenty of data that eventually in the future could be used to check if those super credits and CLEV credits really should apply for certain vehicle models, plug-in hybrid vehicle models. And then also in parallel, we think it is very important to also modify the testing procedures. Patrick has explained that even in the WLTP, the utility factor assumptions are too optimistic given the real-world usage data that we are seeing, and those factors should be updated. I can say that myself, I've been participating in the UN meetings for developing the WLTP. I know that back then we had relatively little data on plug-in hybrid vehicle usage, so it is not a surprise that the factors don't really match with what we're seeing today in reality, but they can be changed, they should be changed, and this I think can be done at the European level. It's not necessary to go with the UN process, which tends to be quite slow. So this is for the European Union level. Moving one level downwards to the national level. Also here we think that the fiscal and also other incentives should really prefer or be based more on the real world data and should prefer plug-in hybrid vehicles with a high electric range and also a high ratio of electric motor power to combustion engine power. So a higher electric range, of course, because then the vehicles tend to be driven more electric or tend to be able to drive more electric, and the high ratio of electric power to combustion engine power, because that we think incentivizes or would incentivize consumers and vehicle drivers to drive the vehicle more in the electric mode and to recharge more often if the electric power was the predominant mode and the combustion engine power would be more limited. Also, at the national level, we think that the qualification for any incentives should be ideally demonstrated using real-world data. For example, again, using onboard fuel consumption meter data, or in the interim phase until those data sources are really uploaded automatically. In the interim phase, you could also use regular technical inspections and get the data from there. Of course, the home charging should be made easier, so any legal and financial barriers should ideally be reduced. Hurdles should be taken away so that consumers can more easily charge. And also at the company car level, we think it's important to provide incentives really only to those companies that provide sufficient working place charging infrastructure, or at least support home and public charging to make sure that the company cars are also recharged regularly. And then Patrick discussed the issue a bit about the charging cost. We have the issue that, especially in some countries, electricity is relatively expensive. So we think charging for electric vehicles in general, for plug-in hybrid vehicles, should be more attractive, while on the other hand, fuel taxes should be raised to make combustion engine or the conventional fuels more expensive to refuel. That's all at the national level. However, we think it's not only up to the regulators to take action. It's also possible and important that the vehicle manufacturers take action. And we recommend that vehicle manufacturers should increase the all-electric range of their plug-in hybrid vehicles. Today, the average electric range of a plug-in hybrid vehicle is around 50 grams per kilometer. That is sometimes not enough to drive all the electric or drive the typical distances on a given day. We think it is important that manufacturers increase the all-electric range to about 90 kilometers on average. And that, we think, will enable most consumers to drive pretty much all the distances on a typical day in electric mode. I should mention that also today already there are some vehicle models that offer such a long electric range, but it's only a few, and we hope really that in the next couple of years we will see many, many more plug-in hybrid vehicles with high electric ranges up to 90 kilometers and more. In parallel, as I just mentioned already, we think the combustion engine power of plug-in hybrid vehicle engines should be limited so that consumers really have an incentive to drive in the electric mode and to recharge regularly. And this should not only happen in the urban driving areas, but also very importantly for extra-urban driving, so that also those consumers that tend to drive their plug-in hybrid vehicles over longer distances, that also those consumers have an incentive to really recharge frequently. And of course, I don't think that should even be mentioned, that should be clear. Manufacturers and their dealers should inform consumers about plug-in hybrid vehicles, the disadvantages, the advantages, and ideally make sure that only those consumers that have a profile that fits for a plug-in hybrid vehicle usage, that only those consumers really pick plug-in hybrid vehicles and drive them. On the fleet manager side, so for company cars, again, it's important that fleet managers inform their customers about plug-in hybrid vehicles and how they are ideally be used, so that only those consumers with a suitable driving and charging behavior ideally choose those vehicles. And more practically, maybe, we think the budget for gasoline and diesel fuel on tank cars should be limited, so that the drivers, the company car drivers, have a limit for refueling their vehicles with conventional fuel, and instead have an incentive and should have a stronger incentive recharging those vehicles with electricity. So to summarize the recommendations, plug-in hybrid vehicles can electrify many kilometers. So the one important objective that we want to bring across with this study is that plug-in hybrid vehicles can be an important part of the puzzle, reducing emissions in the transport sector. They can electrify many kilometers if they are driving in electric ranges and if they are driven mostly on electricity. However, we think that the current policies do not fully support these aspects, and they should be revised accordingly. So in other words, if manufacturers, if politicians really change the framework conditions, we think that plug-in hybrid vehicles can be driven differently and can really be a good technology that also contributes to CO2 reduction. And with this, I think we should now move on to the questions. I hope that you had many good questions, and we're looking forward to discuss any further issues with you now. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Peter and Patrick, for your presentations. We have quite a few questions, so hopefully we will be able to get through as many as possible. Remember, if you do have questions, you can write them in the questions box, and we will, again, take as many as we can. I'd like to start off with the first question for Patrick. Since US vehicles are not typically tested over the NEDC or WLTP for certification, how was the data obtained for comparison of US specific vehicles to the NEDC?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. For the diagrams I showed, we only included US vehicles if there's a really similar vehicle in Europe, or if these vehicles are also available in Europe and have been tested according to the NEDC. A simple example would be the Chevrolet Volt, which is identical to the Opel Ampera available in Europe, which has been NEDC certified.
Thank you. Question for Peter now. Are there similar incentives in Germany, such as tax exemption for company cars, which need long daily trips, or with the fuel, petrol or diesel, paid by the employer, like for the Outlander in the Netherlands?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question, but yes, in Germany, there are strong incentives for plug-in hybrid vehicles. And that explains why we see the market, I think that explains why we see the market share increasing quite drastically at the moment. So they are highly attractive if you purchase them. But I think the problem is that once you have a vehicle, you don't necessarily have the incentive to recharge it frequently. And one of the reasons is, especially here in Germany, that electricity is relatively expensive. And especially if you have a company car, you're typically not paid for that electricity. You have to pay for it yourself. Whereas on the other hand, diesel and gasoline is relatively cheap, especially at the moment. And if you have a company car, that is fully paid by the employer. So there is a disincentive really for charging the vehicle frequently. And if you are not like the most ecologic person and maybe more economic, then it makes absolute sense to drive it with gasoline and diesel instead of electricity. So there's a mismatch between the incentive buying the vehicle and then driving it electric. And I think that should go away. And that's why it's very important to make it more attractive to recharge the vehicle.
Okay, thank you. Another question for Patrick. What is your opinion on the fact that the data pool is at least 2 years old and the likelihood that customer behavior has changed since then, such as more awareness to actually plug in the cars?
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I think there are several aspects to this question. So of course, not all the data is really from the last few months, but also some of the sources are a few years older. Of course, we indicated the age of the individual sources, and I believe for some of the cases, particularly Germany and China, the data is quite recently, has actually been collected at the beginning of this year. So I'd say user behavior hasn't changed much there. For some of the other sources and countries, I would say, well, if the framework conditions have not changed very much, then I would not expect a strong change in user behavior, similar to what Peter just described. If we have company car drivers with strong incentives for purchase, but then no real incentives to drive on electricity during the usage phase, I would expect the situation to be similar. Of course, there can always be new data, newer sources, but I think the key takeaway here is we're not really arguing that the difference is 310 or 250% between real world and test cycle fuel consumption. But I think a really clear and robust finding across all countries and across all the data sources, primary or secondary, is that actual fuel consumption is on average at least twice as high and even higher in a bad economic framework. And I think that is a very robust finding. And I cannot imagine that users within a short period of time start to recharge their vehicle twice as often as they did before.
Okay, thank you very much. For Peter, we have a question with regard to fuel consumption and emissions. Is it more suitable for policymakers to incentivize battery vehicles instead of plug-in hybrids?
It's a very general question. Again, what I want to emphasize is that it depends very much on the usage. So a plug-in hybrid vehicle, if it is used, let's say, suitable, then it can bring almost as much of a CO2 reduction as a battery electric vehicle. Patrick in his presentation said up to 55%. Well, that's not quite as much as a battery electric vehicle, but it's really good. On the other hand, if it's not used suitable, then the emission reduction is not much more than, of a conventional vehicle with some additional technology or of a conventional hybrid electric vehicle. So I think it's more nuanced, and I think the incentives should be structured in such a way that those consumers which have a suitable driving profile, they should be able to buy plug-in hybrid vehicles for an attractive price, I think. But at the same time, it should be ensured that they use them in a suitable way. And here, as I said before, I think it's important to have a balance between the the purchase incentive and the recharging incentive, tax-wise. But then in addition, what I could very well imagine is that the consumer basically, maybe voluntarily, demonstrates that he or she has used the vehicle mainly in electric drive mode, and then gets an additional premium or additional incentive paid from the government. And yeah, and that way you could differentiate. And for those people who feel comfortable with plug-in hybrid vehicle, who adapt their charging behavior, eventually they benefit, and for them, and then plug-in hybrid vehicle makes economic sense. And for those consumers who prefer to drive battery electric vehicle, who have the suitable driving pattern for these kind of vehicles, they could go with these vehicles, and they would receive an adequate incentive for those vehicles. So the answer, I think it's a bit complicated, but I think it needs to be balanced in such a way that everyone can find the vehicle that's most suitable for him or her. And it's, in my opinion, not either battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid vehicles.
Okay, thank you. A question now for Patrick, back to the study. Someone would like to know if you investigated the underlying reasons for the charging behavior, such as less than every night and long daily trips.
Yeah, so maybe about the charging behavior, we actually spent quite some time thinking about the differences between the individual countries, and also talked to some of the experts from other countries. For example, Norway seems to have more frequent charging than Germany, for example. And I think in total, over the countries, it might be a number of reasons. So coming back to the case of Norway, compared to Germany, Norway has much cheaper electricity prices and much higher fuel prices. So there's a stronger economic incentive to drive as much as possible on electricity in Norway compared to Germany. For the US data, the sample mainly contains range extended electric vehicles, which we see due to their long electric ranges, they drive much more on electricity than others. For the case of China, which is also not so good in terms of electric driving, one of the important factors seems to be that garages at home for parking overnight with electricity to easily recharge overnight are less common in China than in North America or Western Europe, and that seems to be one of the strong factors. Of course, in China, it's sometimes necessary to show that you actually have the possibility to charge at home. But again, talking to the Chinese colleagues, it turned out that yes, you have to show something when you buy the vehicle, but then nobody later on will check whether you actually have this at home and you really plug in the vehicle. So it seems to be a number of things, but I guess the most important drivers is the cost comparison between driving on electricity and driving on conventional fuel, and the availability of easy and affordable home charging.
Thank you. To Peter, how should the WLTP test be changed?
It should be changed in a very small way, actually. It is about the utility factor. So the WLTP includes a formula basically that tells you about the utility factor and what is being assumed for each of the vehicles during the testing procedure when the emissions are being calculated, and that needs to be updated. So basically, the utility factor assumptions should be less optimistic, meaning that if a vehicle, for example, has 50 kilometers of electric range, it should receive a different CO2 value attached to this than it is currently the case. It should receive a higher CO2 emission value attached to it than it currently is the case. So it's a relatively small change, and it's basically updating the utility factors to bring them more in line with what Patrick has shown today, what we find from reality.
Thank you. Another one for Peter that we answered partially, but this is more specific, a question about California. The question is, many governments, including California, are planning on phasing out any vehicle with internal combustion engine by 2035 or earlier. Do you think that from a policy perspective, plug-in hybrids should be phased out, or should they be continued to be allowed?
Well, it's a bit in the future. So one thought that I have is we have to see whether plug-in hybrid vehicles can actually continue to be cost effective in the longer run, because if batteries become really that much cheaper, as some industry players are claiming, then I'm not sure whether it really makes sense to keep a relatively complex plug-in hybrid vehicles with 2 propulsion systems. But okay, let's assume that in 2030, 2035, they are still cost competitive and are being purchased in large numbers. Should they be counted basically as electric vehicles and fall under the phase out or not? I would argue it depends again on how they are being used, because what we ultimately want to achieve is not a phase out of certain vehicles, but we want to ultimately achieve decarbonization or a really low CO2 emission value for new vehicles. And if plug-in hybrid vehicles in 2030, 2035 really are driven almost entirely electric with a little bit of CO2 still emitted, then in my opinion, that should be okay. If that's not the case, if the vehicles are driven to a large extent in combustion engine mode, and we find still in many years that the real world emissions are much higher than what is advertised, I hope not, but then those vehicles should not count as zero emission vehicles in my opinion. So it's more a matter of monitoring the real world CO2 emissions, making sure that those are decreasing for the entire fleet, and that those approach really zero basically at the latest by 2035, because otherwise we are not going to meet our climate targets.
Yeah, if I may add to that, backcasting from 2050 might be an interesting thought experiment here. So if a region or government was aiming for zero emissions from transport by 2050, and if a passenger car is in stock for 10 to 15 years, then everything that is being sold after 2035 or 2040, part of that will still be in stock 2050. So if we know that plug-in hybrids, because they will get longer ranges and there are huge incentives for charging and the like, maybe they will be able to drive 90% on electricity, then you would have to make sure for net zero emissions that the remaining 10% of a passenger car fleet in 2050 would be from biofuels or other carbon neutral fuel sources. Then I think from a net zero perspective, then it would be possible to have plug-in hybrids available even after 2050, but then enough zero emission fuels need to be available.
Thank you both for answering that one. Here's another question for Patrick. Can you prove the causality that the battery size is really influencing the driver? Is it the other way around, that the drivers with more ecologic responsibility buy a car with a bigger battery? And when the higher CO2 emissions of battery production is considered for the bigger battery, do you think the recommendation is still valid?
Yeah, well, of course, if you ask a scientist to prove causality, that's very difficult. Of course, also methodologically, that would require a completely different setup. Well, for sure, I mean, just looking at the data, of course, we mainly observe correlations here, but I think there's a clear technical reason to expect more electric driving when you have larger driving, when you have a bigger battery with a bigger electric driving range. So that is, I think that's quite clear, even if you have someone who's not so interested in driving on electricity because he doesn't care about the environment. It's clear that with a longer range, he or she will drive more on electricity. Now, the other part of the question about the emissions from battery production, as I mentioned, we did not perform a life cycle analysis here because, well, first of all, we didn't have time for that. But second of all, I think from a life cycle perspective, it's the electric driving that dominates. So of course, battery production is energy intense and is related to CO2 emissions from production. But we've seen from many studies that that the usage phase is dominant. So I would say the really important thing is to make sure that these vehicles are mainly driven on electricity, really to the vast majority of kilometers on electricity, and then a somewhat bigger battery, maybe twice as big as today, would not really turn around the CO2 emissions from production, but would have a clear impact on the usage phase. So I wouldn't ask for, like, I think we don't, as Peter said, we're not advertising that plug-in hybrids should have 200, 300, 400 kilometers of range, but I think a real world range of 80, 90 kilometer would be just noteworthy increase electric driving without making the carbon content from battery production too large.
Okay, thank you. We are nearing the end of the hour. We may have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'll direct this next one to Peter. The EU has said it will monitor real driving emissions per car from next year. Will this be the catalyst for change on plug-in hybrids?
Could be, yes, but it depends a bit on how quickly that monitoring really is implemented and how quickly we see the data and in which form. Fact is that from this year onwards, manufacturers have to have the technology on board. So the fuel consumption meters have to be installed. They have to be collecting data, aggregating data, and then in the next step, they have to transmit it to the official authorities. And it's not entirely clear yet how that will happen. And then in the next step, it has to be decided how that data is then being processed by the authorities and in which format it is going to be published. But in principle, yes. In principle, that data is wonderful for checking how the vehicles are being used in reality. That is, for example, has been introduced in California a few years ago already, and Europe has learned a lot from California in this respect. So the data will be available, and it should be definitely available to check how certain manufacturers are doing or how certain vehicle models are doing. So you should be able to differentiate, for example, different plug-in hybrid vehicle models and how they are driven in reality, and potentially there could be differences, notable differences between different plug-in hybrid vehicle models. And that by itself could be sufficient to then maybe have manufacturer-specific utility factors for plug-in hybrid vehicles, and thereby incentivize those manufacturers that do a better job informing their consumers for how to drive those vehicles, for example. Theoretically, you could go one step further and go to the consumer level and really monitor data for individual consumers, anonymized, of course, but that would be much harder from a data protection issue level, and I don't believe anything like that would come in the near future. So I would bet more on the model by model data that could be used to adapt the utility factors.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I have one more question that I'd like to direct to the both of you. Now that German rental laws have been updated to allow for home charging, do you expect a material improvement in charging behavior?
Maybe if I start briefly. So just to be sure, of course, home charging has not been forbidden in Germany. So vehicle owners with a private garage or something similar, it was easy and possible for them to charge. I mean, the recent change was only if you have a multi-family dwelling and a shared garage, they made it a bit easier for that. But I think the main change in policy, which you just mentioned in Germany, is to make it easier for future buildings and new charging infrastructure in multi-family homes. But currently, we see that the vast majority of electric vehicle owners already has a garage. So I think that change was important and necessary, but it will more have a long-term effect, I'd say, because it doesn't really concern so many of the current electric vehicle users. Peter, you'd like to add?
No, I have nothing to add in this respect. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. We have effectively run out of time. I know there were a lot more questions that people had. We will try and get these together. And if you would like to directly ask one of the presenters a question, we will be sending out some information over the next few days with the video recording as well as the presentations and a way to get in contact with the presenters. We'd just like to thank everyone for participating in the presentation. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to the webinar's email address if you have any further questions. Remember to follow us at the ICCT as well as the ISI account. And thank you again, and we hope to see you soon.